I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, doing a little light bookkeeping and wondering if I could talk Fritz into making a batch of those ham and cheese soufflés for lunch, when the doorbell rang. It was 9:04 on a Tuesday morning. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, where he'd been since 9, probably having a heart-to-heart with an odontoglossum. I looked through the one-way glass of the front door and saw a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that only made librarians. He was thin, carried a leather satchel that had seen better decades, and wore the kind of spectacles that made his eyes look like two confused eggs. I opened the door, but I didn't let him in, not yet. "If you're looking for the public library, it's 2 blocks over," I said. "If you're looking for Nero Wolfe, he's currently in a state of grace with some orchids and won't be back on this planet until 11. The man looked up, blinking. "My name is Silas Crane. I am the curator of the Sterling collection. I have a matter of life and death, or rather a matter of death and books." He clutched his satchel. "Tell Mr. Wolfe that the Gutenberg ghost has returned." I stood there for a second. I didn't know a Gutenberg from a golf ball, but I knew the name Sterling. Percival Sterling was a billionaire whose hobby was buying things that were printed before the invention of the light bulb. "Wait here," I said, and I didn't wait for him to argue. I went to the house phone and buzzed the plant rooms. When Wolfe answered, he sounded like a man being interrupted during a coronation. "Yes, Archie? We have a curator on the stoop," I said. "Name is Silas Crane. He says he has a matter of death and books, and he mentioned something called the Gutenberg ghost. He looks like he hasn't slept since the mid-50s. There was a silence on the other end, not the silence of a man thinking, but the silence of a man deciding how much he was going to hate the next hour. "Is he alone?" "Unless he's got a ghost in that satchel, yes. Bring him to the office, Archie, and tell him he will wait. I shall be down in 10 minutes. I hung up, feeling that familiar itch in my palms. For Wolfe to leave his orchids 10 minutes early was equivalent to the sun rising in the west. I went back to the door, ushered Silas Crane inside, and showed him to the red leather chair. He sat on the edge of it, looking around the room with a mixture of awe and terror. "Mr. Wolfe will be down shortly," I said, taking my seat at my own desk. "In the meantime, why don't you tell me why a ghost is worth a trip to West 35th Street? Crane looked at the desk, then at the bookshelves that lined the walls. "It's not a ghost of a person, Mr. Goodwin. It's a ghost of a book, a 1455 Bible. It was stolen from the Sterling vault 40 years ago, and last night a single page from it appeared on the desk of my assistant, and then I found him, or what was left of him." "The assistant?" Crane nodded, his hands shaking, dead, in the middle of the rare book room. The door was locked from the inside, and the only thing in the room besides the body was that page. Before I could ask how a piece of vellum kills a man, the elevator groaned. The mountain was descending. Wolfe entered the office, his yellow silk vest appearing like a stationary sun in the doorway. He didn't look at Crane. He walked straight to his desk, sat in the chair that was the only piece of furniture in the world capable of supporting his ego and his bulk, and gestured toward the satchel. "Open it," Wolfe commanded. Silas Crane did as he was told. Out came a single sheet of paper, or vellum, I guess. It was thick, yellowed, and covered in Latin script that looked like it had been written by a monk with a very steady hand. But it wasn't the Latin that caught my eye. It was the smudge of dark, dried blood across the bottom corner. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He didn't touch the page. "The Gutenberg ghost," he murmured. "Arthur Penhaligon's Last Folly." "You know the book?" Crane asked, his voice a whisper. "I know the man who died for it 40 years ago," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that low melodic rumble that usually preceded a disaster. "And I know the man who is currently dying for it. Archie, call Inspector Cramer. Tell him we have a guest who has brought us a piece of a crime scene. And tell Fritz to prepare a light lunch. We are going to need our strength for the stench of a vault that has been turned into a morgue." Wolfe reached for his beer, but he didn't drink. He held the glass up to the light, watching the bubbles rise. The sanctity of the brownstone had been disturbed by a piece of dead history, and for Nero Wolfe, that was the ultimate trespass. "We take the case," Wolfe announced. "Who's the client?" I asked. "The librarian or the ghost?" "The client is the integrity of the printed word, Archie. Someone has used a Bible to commit a murder. I will not have the history of the world tarnished by such vulgarity." I reached for the phone. The quiet morning was over. The death among the rare books was no longer just a title. It was a promise of a very long, very bloody day. By the time Nero Wolfe had consumed his second bottle of beer and Silas Crane had finished his third glass of water, the office felt as though it had been transported into the 19th century. The presence of that single blood-stained page of vellum on the desk seemed to suck the modern world right out of the room. I had called Inspector Cramer, and while he hadn't arrived yet, I could hear the city's distant sirens as if they were mourning the dead assistant. Wolfe sat motionless, his eyes travelling over the page without touching it, his lips moving in a silent, rhythmic pout that meant he was sifting through 40 years of mental files. Crane sat in the red-leathered chair, looking smaller than ever. He began to describe the Sterling collection, located in a limestone fortress on the Upper East Side. It wasn't just a library, it was a sanctuary of the rare and the impossible. The assistant who had died was a young man named Philip Hart, a brilliant scholar who had been obsessed with the provenance of the Gutenberg Bible. According to Crane, Hart had stayed late to inventory a new acquisition, a set of medieval maps, and had been found the next morning slumped over his desk in the middle of the locked vault. "The smell, Mr. Wolfe," Crane whispered, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "That's what haunted me. It wasn't just the smell of death. It was the smell of the books. They seemed to be exhaling, and that page was tucked under Philip's hand as if he had been trying to hide it even as he died." Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep subterranean dissatisfaction. "A locked vault, Mr. Crane, is an invitation to the ingenious. You say the door's bolted from the inside. How did you enter?" "I have the master key, of course," Crane said, "but the bolt is manual. It can only be turned from the interior. We had to use a specialized saw to cut through the secondary security plate. There is no other way in or out. No windows, no ventilation shafts large enough for a cat, let alone a man." I leaned against the corner of my desk, crossing my arms. "So we have a ghost who can walk through steel doors, or Philip Hart decided to commit suicide by Latin grammar. Which is it?" "Philip was not suicidal," Crane insisted, his voice cracking. "He was on the verge of a breakthrough. He told me yesterday that he had found a mirrored signature in the Sterling records. He was terrified, Mr. Goodwin. He said someone was watching the library from the inside. The doorbell rang then, not the polite chime of a visitor, but the demanding, rhythmic pounding that could only belong to Inspector Cramer. I went to the front door and let him in. He looked like he'd slept in a blender and hadn't enjoyed the experience. He marched into the office, his eyes landing on the vellum page on Wolfe's desk before they even found Wolfe himself. "I knew it," Cramer barked, not bothering with a greeting. "I get a report of a dead kid in a locked room at the Sterling Library, and 10 minutes later Goodwin's on the phone talking about vellum and ghosts. What is this, Wolfe? What have you got?" "I have a guest, Inspector," Wolfe said, his voice as smooth as silk. "And I have a piece of evidence that was removed from the scene of a crime." Mr. Crane felt that the police would be too distracted by the mechanics of the locked door to appreciate the significance of the document. Cramer took a seat in the other leather chair, his jaw set. "The mechanics are exactly what I'm interested in. The kid died of a heart attack, according to the first look. No marks on him, no poison in the air, nothing. But the room was sealed. Now you tell me why a page from a 500-year-old Bible is sitting on your desk dripping with blood." "It is not dripping, Inspector. It is dry," Wolfe corrected. "And it is not a heart attack. Philip Hart died of terror, or perhaps of a very specific kind of intellectual betrayal. This page is not just any vellum, it is the leaf that contains the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, For a bibliophile, to see this page outside of its binding is a sacrilege. To see it stained with blood is a death sentence. Wolfe finally leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle. The atmosphere in the office had shifted from a consultation to an interrogation. The outsiders had brought the dust of the crime into our sanctuary, and Wolfe was starting to realize that the Sterling Library wasn't the only place being watched. He looked at the bookshelf behind my desk, then back at Crane. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes half closing. "Mr. Crane will stay with us for the afternoon. I want the house secured. If anyone arrives claiming to represent the Sterling family or the police, they are to wait on the stoop. I will not have my hall cluttered with the curious. And Inspector, if you wish to find the killer, stop looking at the bolt on the door. Look at the people who have the most to lose if that Bible is ever found whole." "I've got a list a mile long," Cramer muttered. "Collectors, dealers, even the old man Sterling himself. They're all nuts when it comes to this stuff." "Precisely," Wolfe remarked. "And one of them is nuts enough to believe that a locked door can keep the truth inside. We shall prove him wrong. But first, I believe Fritz has prepared the trout. We shall eat, and then we shall begin the deconstruction of the Sterling circle." I led Crane to the dining room, but I kept my eye on the office door. The brownstone felt different today, larger and more full of shadows. The smell of old paper seemed to be clinging to the curtains, a dry, ancient scent that promised a very long and very dangerous night. The outsiders were here, the pressure was mounting, and for the first time in a long time I felt like the walls were starting to talk. After the trout had been cleared and Silas Crane had been safely tucked away in the front room with a glass of sherry and a volume of Churchill memoirs to keep his nerves from fraying completely, Wolfe returned to his desk. He had that look in his eye, the one that suggested he was mentally cataloguing every major rare book heist since the invention of the printing press. I sat at my desk, my notebook open, ready to record the names of the people who would soon be wishing they had never heard of Percival Sterling or his limestone fortress. "The Sterling Circle, Archie," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into a dry instructional tone. "It is not a group of friends, it is a collection of rivals who happen to share the same obsession. To a bibliophile, a book is not a vessel for information, it is a fetish. And the Gutenberg ghost is the ultimate fetish. We must identify the 4 people who were in the library at the time of Philip Hart's demise." I looked at the list Silas Crane had scribbled out for me during lunch. "First up is Percival Sterling himself," I said. "He's 84, worth more than the mint, and hasn't left the penthouse above the library in 3 years. He's the one who bought the Bible originally, or at least the fragments of it." Wolfe grunted. "A man of his age does not kill for a book he already owns. He kills to ensure he is the last one to have owned it. Who else? Then there's Dr. Alistair Finch," I continued. "He's the resident expert on medieval vellum. Crane says he and Hart had a standing argument about the chemical composition of the ink on the Gutenberg pages. Finch is the one who certified the ghost as authentic 40 years ago. An expert whose reputation is tied to a single discovery is a man with a target on his back," Wolfe remarked. "If Hart found a mirrored signature, he was likely proving that the page was a forgery, or worse, that the original had been replaced by one." "Continue." "Number 3 is Evelyn Thorne," I said. "She's a high-end book restorer. She has a workspace inside the Sterling vault. She's the only one besides Crane and Hart who had a key to the inner sanctum. Crane says she's a perfectionist who treats books better than people. And the 4th, a man named Julian Vane. He's a scout for rare manuscripts. He's the one who brought the set of medieval maps to the library yesterday, the ones Philip Hart was supposed to be inventorying when he died. Vane has a reputation for finding things that don't want to be found, and he's been seen around the Sterling mansion at odd hours." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers tap-tap-tapping against the arms of his chair. "A collector, an expert, a restorer, and a scout. A perfect quadrangle of suspicion. Each had the access, and each has a motive rooted in the preservation of a lie. Hart was the variable, Archie. He was the young man with the inconvenient habit of looking too closely. "So we have a locked room and 4 people who could have been inside," I said. "But Cramer said there was no sign of a struggle and no poison. How do you kill a man in a vault without touching him?" "You don't kill the man, Archie, you kill the air he breathes," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. "Or you present him with a truth so devastating that his own biology betrays him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. I want you to go to the Sterling Library. Do not speak to Sterling, he will be behind a wall of lawyers. Speak to the restorer, Miss Thorne. A woman who spends her life repairing the past often knows exactly where the seams are starting to come apart." I reached for my hat. The brownstone felt like a pressure cooker, and I was glad for the chance to get out into the city air, even if it was just to trade one limestone fortress for another. "One more thing, Archie," Wolfe called out as I reached the door. "Observe the hands of Dr. Finch. A man who works with ancient ink often carries the stains of his profession long after he has left the lab. And check the ventilation in that vault. If Philip Hart died of a heart attack, I want to know what the air was telling him." I headed for the Heron, my mind racing through the list. Percival Sterling, the aging lion, Alistair Finch, the defensive scholar, Evelyn Thorne, the silent restorer, and Julian Vane, the shadow in the stacks. They were all part of the circle, and one of them had decided that Philip Hart was a chapter that needed to be closed permanently. When I arrived at the Sterling Library, the atmosphere was even grimmer than Crane had described. The police tape across the heavy bronze doors looked like a scar. I used my credentials, and a little of the Goodwin charm, to get past the patrolman and into the main hall. It was a place of soaring marble and hushed whispers, where the very air felt like it had been filtered through a century of dust and ego. I found Evelyn Thorne in the restoration lab, a small room off the main vault. She was a woman in her late 40s with hair the color of iron and eyes that didn't seem to blink. She was currently hovering over a piece of parchment with a magnifying glass, her hands moving with a precision that was almost hypnotic. "Mr. Wolfe is interested in the vellum," I said by way of introduction. She didn't look up. "The vellum is fine, it's the people that are the problem. Philip was a fool. He thought he could read between the lines of a ghost. He didn't understand that some stories are written in blood for a reason." She finally looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something that wasn't grief, it was fear. "Tell Mr. Wolfe that the mirrored signature isn't a myth, it's a map, and Philip Hart followed it right to the end of the world." I looked around the lab, my eyes landing on a small, open vents near the ceiling. There was a faint, bitter smell in the air, something like burnt almonds, but sharper. The circle was tightening, and the rare books were starting to tell a story that wasn't in the catalogue. The air in the Sterling Library felt as if it had been bottled in the 14th century and left to ferment. After leaving Evelyn Thorne in her lab, I took a slow walk through the main stacks. The silence was so heavy you could almost hear the molecules of the paper decomposing. I was looking for Dr. Alistair Finch. I found him in a partitioned cubicle that looked like a monk's cell, if monks were allowed to have high-end microscopes and a collection of expensive briar pipes. He was a man who seemed to be made entirely of tweed and indignation, with a fringe of white hair that stood up like a defensive perimeter around his skull. "Goodwin, from Nero Wolfe?" Finch's voice sounded like 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. He didn't look up from a set of slides he was examining. "I told the police everything. Philip was a talented boy, but he was prone to romanticism. He believed the Gutenberg ghost was a puzzle to be solved. He didn't realize it was a legacy to be protected." "Wolfe has a different theory about legacies," I said, leaning against his mahogany desk. "He thinks they're just secrets that have stayed in the dark long enough to grow teeth. What about this mirrored signature Philip was talking about? He seemed to think it was a map to something more than just a typo in a Bible." Finch's hands stiffened. I remembered Wolfe's instructions and looked at his fingers. They were stained, all right, not with the fresh blue ink of a fountain pen, but with a deep, permanent brownish purple that had worked its way into the cuticles. It was the mark of a man who dealt with iron gall ink, the kind that eats into the paper as much as it writes on it. "Mirrored signatures are a common fluke in early printing," Finch snapped, finally looking at me. His eyes were small and sharp, like 2 beads of obsidian. The ink on one page transfers to the opposite leaf before it's fully dry. It's a technical error, nothing more. Philip thought it was a code. He was seeing ghosts in the machinery. And Julian Vane, was he seeing ghosts too? Finch let out a short, dry laugh. Vane sees only $signs. He's a scavenger. He brought those maps in to distract Philip, to get him looking at coordinates, while the real business was being conducted elsewhere. If you want to find out who killed that boy, Goodwin, look for the person who stands to gain from a blank space in the Sterling catalogue. I left Finch to his slides and headed for the service exit. I had a feeling the alleys of ash and ink weren't just a metaphor. I spent the next 3 hours tracking Julian Vane. It wasn't easy. Vane was a professional shadow. But Saul Panzer had given me a tip about a basement bookstore on 4th Avenue, where the light-fingered members of the bibliophile set liked to trade. I found Vane in the back of the shop, hidden behind a stack of Victorian cookbooks. He was younger than the others, with a face that looked like it had been sharpened on a whetstone and a smile that didn't bother to reach his eyes. He wasn't surprised to see me. "Archie Goodwin," he said, closing a small leather-bound volume. "I hear the brownstone has a new boarder. How is Silas Crane holding up? I imagine he's worried about his pension now that his star pupil has met a locked-room ending." "Wolfe wants to know about the maps, Vane," I said, not wasting time on the pleasantries. "The ones you brought to the library yesterday. Finch says they were a distraction. Crane says they're part of the ghost's history. What do you say?" Vane leaned back, his eyes scanning the shop for an exit. "I say that Philip Hart found something in those maps that he wasn't supposed to find. Not a code, but a location. The Gutenberg ghost wasn't stolen 40 years ago, Goodwin. It was divided. The page Wolfe has in his office, that's just the beginning. The rest of it is buried in the one place no one would think to look, because everyone assumes it's already empty." "And where's that?" Vane's smile widened. "Ask Evelyn Thorne about the binding room in the sub-basement, and ask her why she carries a gas mask in her restoration kit." Before I could grab him by the lapels, a stack of books near the door accidentally tipped over, creating a momentary wall of paper. By the time I cleared the obstacle, Vane was gone, vanished into the grey afternoon fog of 4th Avenue. I drove back to 35th Street with my head spinning. The mirrored signature, the stained hands of Dr. Finch, the bitterness of the air in the lab, and now a hidden binding room. When I walked back into the office, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, though he had added a second bottle of beer to his blotter. Silas Crane was asleep in the front room, his snores audible through the heavy door. "The circle is widening, Wolfe," I said, dropping my hat. "Finch has ink on his hands that hasn't moved in years. Thorne is hiding something in the basement, and Vane thinks the Bible was never stolen at all, just chopped up and hidden in plain sight. Also, someone is using gas masks for more than just dust." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. He didn't look surprised, he looked satisfied. "The ink on the hands, Archie, was it the colour of a bruised plum?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "Because Dr. Finch is not an expert on vellum," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "He is an expert on concealment, and the gas mask is not for the books, it is for the air. We are no longer dealing with a theft, Archie. We are dealing with the preservation of a crime that has been breathing in that library for 40 years. Tell Saul to meet us at the Sterling mansion at midnight. We are going to find the binding room." I checked the load in my 38. The alleys were leaden with secrets, and the ink was starting to run. The transition from the library back to the brownstone was supposed to be a cooling-off period, but the atmosphere inside the office was tighter than a new drum. Wolfe was back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the vellum page with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. Silas Crane had been moved back into the office from the front room, and he looked like a man who had seen his own obituary printed in a first edition. The sanctity of our home had been breached, not by a physical intruder, but by the weight of the Sterling secrets. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, the hour when Wolfe usually enjoys his second session with the orchids, but today the elevator remained stationary. He was waiting for something, and as usual, I was the one who had to find out what it was. I had been back for 10 minutes when I noticed it. I have a habit of checking my desk every time I return from a trip into the field, not because I'm paranoid, but because in this house, a shifted paperclip can be a message from the beyond. On the far corner of my blotter, next to the pen set, was a book. It wasn't one of mine, and it certainly wasn't one of Wolfe's. It was a small, leather-bound volume, the spine cracked and the gold leaf peeling. I picked it up with a frown. It was a first edition of Poe's Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. "Wolfe," I said, holding the book up by the edges, "we've had a visitor, or Fritz has taken up a sudden interest in 19th century horror. This was sitting on my desk, and it wasn't there when I left for the library." Wolfe didn't even turn his head. It was not Fritz, Archie, and it was not an intruder in the conventional sense. It arrived via the service entrance at 3 o'clock, a messenger from the Sterling estate, ostensibly bringing a gift of appreciation for Mr. Crane's safety. But look at the title page. I opened the book. The paper was foxed and brittle, smelling of damp cellars and forgotten sins. On the title page, written in a cramped, scholarly hand that I recognized from Philip Hart's notes, was a single sentence: "The air in the binding room is the breath of the ghost." "A displaced first edition," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "A classic maneuver of the bibliophile. To send a rare volume as a warning is to speak a language of absolute finality. The person who sent this knows that you spoke to Julian Vane, Archie. They know that you are aware of the sub-basement, and they are telling us that the air there is not merely stale, it is lethal." I looked at Silas Crane. He had gone a shade of grey that matched the vellum. "The binding room," he whispered. "It was sealed 40 years ago. Percival Sterling said the chemicals used for the leather preservation were too toxic for modern standards." Philip had been asking for the blueprints of the ventilation system for weeks. I thought he was just being thorough. "He was being a detective, Mr. Crane," Wolfe said, his eyes finally moving to the curator. "And he discovered that the toxicity of the binding room was a convenient fiction. It wasn't the chemicals that were dangerous. It was what was being preserved behind the sealed vents." "Archie, what did you smell in Evelyn Thorne's lab?" "Burnt almonds," I said, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. "Cyanide, but it was faint, like it had been filtered through a dozen layers of stone." "Precisely," Wolfe remarked. "The mirrored signature Philip found was not a typo, it was a residue. 40 years ago, when the Gutenberg Bible was stolen, it was actually being treated with a cyanide-based preservative to stop a particular strain of vellum rot that was destroying the Sterling collection. The process was botched. The gas didn't just kill the rot, it permeated the pages. The Bible became a weapon. To open it without the proper ventilation is to inhale a death sentence." I set the Poe volume down on the desk. "So Philip Hart didn't have a heart attack. He opened a book he wasn't supposed to see, and the ghost literally breathed on him." "And that page on your desk? The blood on the corner?" "The blood belongs to Arthur Penhaligon," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. "The man who died 40 years ago trying to steal the ghost. He didn't know about the gas. He was the first victim of the Sterling preservation, and someone, likely Dr. Finch or Miss Thorne, has been maintaining that lethal atmosphere ever since to ensure the Bible remains stolen and unseen, protecting the secret of the botched restoration." The doorbell rang then. I didn't wait for Wolfe's nod. I was already moving toward the hall with my hand on the 38. Through the glass, I saw a figure in a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped high around their face. They weren't waiting for an answer, they were tucking something into the mail slot. By the time I got the door open, the sidewalk was empty, the fog swallowing the retreating footsteps. I pulled a small glass vial from the slot. It was empty, save for a single dark purple stain at the bottom, the same plum-coloured ink I'd seen on Alistair Finch's hands. "The pressure is increasing," I said, bringing the vial into the office. "Someone's getting sloppy, or they're trying to tell us that the clock is ticking. If that Bible is as toxic as you say, and someone is moving it—" "They aren't moving it, Archie," Wolfe said, standing up with a sudden, surprising grace. "They are preparing to destroy it. A fire in the Sterling sub-basement would solve many problems. It would erase the evidence of the cyanide, it would claim the ghost as a casualty of tragedy rather than crime, and it would ensure that the mirrored signature never tells its story. We are going to the Sterling mansion, now." I headed for the Heron. The displaced first edition was still sitting on my desk, a silent witness to a crime that had been breathing in the dark for 4 decades. The rare books were about to go up in flames, and Nero Wolfe was the only man who knew how to read the smoke. The drive to the Sterling mansion was performed in a silence so thick you could have bound it in leather and shelved it. Wolfe sat in the back of the Heron, his bulk a motionless shadow, while Silas Crane huddled in the passenger seat, vibrating like a tuning fork. The city was a blur of neon and fog, but as we approached the Upper East Side, the world turned to stone and cold iron. The Sterling residence wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of limestone that seemed to absorb the light of the street lamps without reflecting any of it back. I parked the Heron half a block away, near a dormant fire hydrant. "Saul is already in position," I whispered, checking my watch. It was 11:42 p.m. "He's at the service entrance near the alley. He says the regular night watchman was sent home early with a sudden case of stomach flu and replaced by a man in a grey uniform who doesn't know the difference between a master key and a tire iron." Wolfe grunted as he extricated himself from the car, a process that usually reminds me of a slow-motion tectonic shift. "A surrogate watchman," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "The final piece of the staging. They are preparing for a catastrophe that requires a witness who is both incompetent and expendable. Archie, the vial from the mail slot, did you bring it?" "Right here," I said, patting my breast pocket, "along with the Poe first edition. If we're going into a cyanide trap, I'd rather have a book to throw than nothing at all." We moved toward the service entrance. Saul Panzer appeared out of the fog like he'd been manufactured from it. He was wearing his old brown cap and a jacket that made him look like a weary delivery man, but his eyes were as sharp as a pair of new scalpels. He didn't waste words. He pointed a thumb toward the basement door. "The new guy is in the security booth, nursing a thermos of coffee that probably has enough sedative in it to put out a horse," Saul reported. "But there's a second man. He went down to the sub-basement 10 minutes ago carrying a heavy satchel and a canister. I didn't see his face, but he moves like someone who knows exactly where the weight-bearing walls are." "The binding room," Silas Crane wheezed, clutching my arm. "If he has a canister, he's going to trigger the fire suppression system. But the Sterling system doesn't use water. It uses halon and a chemical retardant that will react with the cyanide residue. It won't just put out a fire, it will create a toxic cloud that will dissolve every page in that vault." Wolfe's face was a mask of cold, hard focus. A chemical erasure, brilliant and utterly loathsome. "Archie, you and Saul will handle the intruder. Mr. Crane and I will remain by the ventilation controls. If the system is triggered, I must be able to reverse the flow of the air before the reaction reaches the upper floors." "You're staying in the basement?" I asked, looking at him. "Wolfe, if that gas starts moving, you aren't exactly built for a 100-yard dash. I shall be perfectly safe if you do your job," Wolfe remarked, though I noticed his fingers were gripping the head of his cane with unusual force. "Go. The watchman in the booth is no longer our concern. The man in the stacks is the one holding the match." Saul and I slipped through the service door. The basement of the Sterling mansion was a labyrinth of steam pipes and heavy masonry. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and the peculiar metallic scent of old machinery. We moved toward the stairs that led to the sub-basement, our footsteps muffled by the rubber soles of our shoes. As we descended, the smell changed. It was the burnt almond scent I'd detected in the lab, but stronger now, cloying and thick. It felt like it was coating the back of my throat. I saw a flicker of light at the end of a long corridor, the entrance to the binding room. The heavy steel door was standing open, its seals broken. Standing in the center of the room was a man. He was wearing a gas mask, but even with the goggles and the snout, I recognized the silhouette. It was Julian Vane, the scout. He wasn't looking for books. He was attaching a small electronic detonator to a large pressurized canister labeled Sterling Fire Retardant. "I'd put the screwdriver down, Vane," I said, stepping into the light with my .38 leveled at his heart. unless you want to find out if halon is flammable when mixed with lead. Vane didn't jump. He turned slowly, the glass eyes of the mask reflecting the dim light of the corridor. He didn't speak, but he raised his left hand. In it he held a single ancient-looking volume, the rest of the Gutenberg Ghost. He moved it toward the canister, a silent threat to drop the most valuable book in the world into a chemical bath. "You won't do it," Saul said from the shadows to my right. "You're a scout, Vane. You live for the find. You can't destroy the one thing that makes you the best in the business." "I'm not destroying it," Vane's voice came through the mask, muffled and metallic. "I'm liberating it, from the lies, from the rot, and from the old men who think they can keep history in a cage. If I can't have it, nobody can. That was the deal." "Whose deal?" I asked, stepping closer. "Finch's? Thorne's?" Suddenly the lights in the sub-basement flickered and died. In the absolute darkness I heard the hiss of a valve being opened. The increased pressure was no longer a metaphor. The air was moving and the ghost was finally starting to scream. I lunged forward, but I wasn't fighting a man. I was fighting the dark, and the smell of almonds was suddenly everywhere. The darkness in the sub-basement was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized blackness that makes you feel as though your eyes have been physically removed. I didn't fire. In a room filled with unknown chemical vapors and pressurized gas, a muzzle flash could have turned the Sterling mansion into a very expensive chimney. I heard Saul's sharp intake of breath to my right and the frantic metallic scraping of Julian Vane's boots against the concrete. The hiss of the escaping gas was a rhythmic predatory sound, like a serpent coiled in the corner of the room. "Saul, the door!" I yelled, diving toward the last place I'd seen the glimmer of Vane's mask. My shoulder hit a stack of crates, likely empty binding cases, and they went down with a clatter that echoed like a landslide. I scrambled up, my fingers brushing against cold steel and damp vellum. I felt the rough texture of a book cover, the ghost itself, and I gripped it with a strength that probably would have offended every curator in the city. Then a heavy weight crashed into my side. Vane was no longer trying to sabotage the room, he was trying to claw his way out, and I was in the way. We tumbled into the corridor just as a secondary light source flickered to life. It wasn't the overheads, it was the emergency beam from the security booth, casting long, sickly yellow shadows down the hall. In the dim glow I saw Wolfe. He hadn't run. He was standing by the massive iron wheel of the ventilation manifold, Silas Crane cowering behind him. Wolfe's face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He had his hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, and as I watched, he heaved against it with a strength that ignored his bulk and his years. "Archie!" Wolfe's voice was a clarion call that cut through the hiss of the gas. "The secondary seal, turn the lever." I didn't stop to think. I ignored Vane, who was scurrying toward the stairs like a panicked rat, and lunged for the red-painted lever on the wall. I threw my weight against it. There was a groan of protesting metal, a sound like a giant clearing its throat, and then the roar of the fans changed pitch. The orchestrated silence of the basement was replaced by a localized gale as the massive turbines began to pull the toxic air out of the binding room and vent it toward the street. Wolfe stood firm, his hands still on the wheel, watching the pressure gauge. Only when the needle dipped back into the green did he let out a long, shuddering breath and allow his shoulders to slump. He looked at me, then at the book in my hand. "The vellum, Archie," he said, his voice raspy from the exertion. "Is it intact?" "A little bruised, just like me, but it's here," I said, leaning against the cold stone wall to catch my breath. "Bring it," Wolfe commanded, "and Saul, bring Mr. Vane." He won't have gone far. The watchman I sedated earlier was merely a placeholder. The real security team, under the direction of the district attorney's office, has already cordoned off the alley. We didn't wait for the police to finish their sweep. Wolfe led us back up the stairs, his cane tapping a steady, rhythmic beat on the stone. We bypassed the main hall and went straight to the penthouse elevator. The orchestration was moving into its final phase. Wolfe hadn't just saved the book, he had positioned the suspects. By triggering the alarm and reversing the fans, he had created a crisis that forced every player in the Sterling circle to move toward the center. When the elevator doors opened into the Sterling penthouse, the scene was already set. The room was a palace of glass and mahogany, perched high above the city. Percival Sterling sat in a motorized wheelchair by the window, looking like a mummy wrapped in expensive wool. Dr. Alistair Finch was there, pacing the floor with a nervous energy that made his tweed jacket look 3 sizes too small. Evelyn Thorne was sitting on a velvet sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of iron-hard composure. They all turned as we entered. Wolfe didn't wait for an invitation. He marched to the center of the room, claimed a chair that looked substantial enough to hold him, and placed his cane across his knees. I stood by the door, the Gutenberg ghost tucked under my arm, while Saul stayed in the shadows with a cuffed and masked Julian Vane. "The silence is over," Wolfe announced, his voice filling the room with the authority of a judge. "The ghost has been exorcised from the sub-basement, and the secret of the Sterling preservation is no longer a matter of private record. Philip Hart died because he realized that this library was not a sanctuary for books, but a graveyard for the truth, and one of you decided that the graveyard needed another inhabitant. This is an outrage, Wolfe, Dr. Finch shouted, his plum-stained hands trembling. "You've compromised the most delicate restoration project in the country. The gas was a necessity." "The gas was a murder weapon, Doctor," Wolfe remarked, his eyes narrowing. "And the restoration was a lie. You didn't preserve the Bible, you poisoned it to ensure that no one, not even Philip Hart, could ever prove that the original Gutenberg had been sold to a private collector in Zurich 40 years ago. The ghost in the vault was a magnificent forgery, created by Miss Thorne and certified by you." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the hum of the city lights 30 stories below. Percival Sterling didn't move. Evelyn Thorne didn't blink. Only Finch seemed to be crumbling, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "The orchestration is complete," Wolfe said, his eyes travelling from Finch to Thorne to the old man in the chair. "Now we shall have the final chapter. Archie, tell Fritz to have the office ready. We are going home. The Sterling circle is about to be broken, and I prefer to do my dismantling in a chair that fits me." I signaled to the plainclothesman waiting in the hall. The pressure was at its peak. The silence had been broken, and the truth was finally starting to bleed through the vellum. The office was no longer a room. It was a theatre of intellectual combat, bathed in the sharp, unforgiving light of the overhead chandelier. It was nearly 2 in the morning, but Wolfe sat in his chair as if the day had only just begun, his presence filling the space between the bookshelves and the red leather chairs. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of old dust and the lingering metallic tang of the chemicals from the Sterling basement. Silas Crane was hunched in a corner, clutching a cold cup of tea, while the 3 primary suspects sat in a semicircle before Wolfe's desk. Dr. Alistair Finch was grey-faced, his plum-stained fingers twitching on his knees. Evelyn Thorne sat as still as a statue, her iron-grey hair reflecting the light. Between them, Julian Vane, now uncuffed but guarded by Saul Panzer at the door, looked like a predator who had finally realized the cage was electrified. I stood by the globe, the Gutenberg ghost resting on the blotter in front of Wolfe. I had my hand on the back of my chair, my eyes moving from Finch to Thorne to Vane, watching for the first crack in the masonry. Wolfe didn't speak for a full minute. He simply sat there, his eyes half closed, his lips moving in a silent, rhythmic pout. He was sifting through the layers of the Sterling circle, peeling back 40 years of deception with the clinical precision of a surgeon. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a melodic rumble that seemed to settle the room, to discuss the anatomy of a forgery and the cost of its preservation. For 4 decades, the Sterling Library has been a temple built on a foundation of sand. The Gutenberg Bible, the crown jewel of the collection, was not stolen by Arthur Penhaligon 40 years ago. It was sold by Percival Sterling himself to cover a catastrophic loss in the copper markets a loss that would have bankrolled his rivals and stripped him of his empire. But a man of Sterling's vanity cannot admit to a loss. He required a miracle, and he found it in the hands of a young expert and a brilliant restorer. Finch started to speak, but Wolfe silenced him with a flick of his finger. "Do not interrupt. The mechanics are simple. Dr. Finch, you provided the certification of the theft and the subsequent recovery of the fragments. Miss Thorne, you created the ghost, a forgery so masterful that it could pass any test except the one Philip Hart finally devised. You used vellum from a contemporaneous source and ink that you aged chemically. But you made a mistake. To stop the ink from bleeding on the synthetic vellum, you used a cyanide-based fixative. You turned the Bible into a poison to hide the fact that it was a fake." Evelyn Thorne spoke then, her voice a low, steady drone. "It wasn't just about the money, Mr. Wolfe. It was about the art. The original was being neglected, rotting in a humid vault. I gave the world a perfect version. I preserved the idea of the Gutenberg, even if the physical object was gone." "You preserved a lie," Wolfe snapped, "and you killed to maintain it. Philip Hart found the mirrored signature, a residue of the fixative that shouldn't have been there. He realized that the ghost was a chemical construct. He was going to expose the forgery, and in doing so destroy Percival Sterling's legacy and your careers. So, you utilized the very toxicity you had created. You ensured that when Philip Hart opened the vault to perform his final test, the air he breathed would be his last." "I didn't kill him," Finch shouted, his voice cracking. "I was in my office. I didn't turn the valves." "No," Wolfe said, his eyes shifting to Julian Vane. "You didn't have the stomach for it, Doctor. You provided the technical expertise, and Miss Thorne provided the forgery. But you needed someone to handle the physical trespass, someone who could move through the library without being questioned. Mr. Vane, you were not a scout for rare books. You were the Sterling family's cleaner. You were the one who staged the locked room, who ensured the ventilation was cut, and who attempted to destroy the evidence tonight when you realized the ghost had started to haunt its creators." Vane leaned back, a thin, cold smile playing on his lips. "You can't prove I was in that vault when Hart died, Wolfe. I was in a bookstore on 4th Avenue. I have witnesses." "Witnesses can be bought, Mr. Vane, but chemistry is immutable," Wolfe remarked. He reached out and picked up the small vial I had retrieved from the mail slot earlier. "This vial contains a residue of the plum-colored ink Miss Thorne used for the forgery. It also contains traces of the halon gas from the fire suppression system. Gas that was only released tonight. You carried this on your person, a signature of your presence in the sub-basement. And more importantly, you left something behind in your haste to escape the fumes." Wolfe looked at me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver-plated key. I had found it in the binding room during the struggle. "This key fits the emergency override for the Sterling ventilation system," I said. "The one that was used to trap Philip Hart. It has your initials on the fob, Vane. A little gift from the Sterling estate for your years of service." The silence that followed was heavy and final. Vane's smile vanished. Finch buried his face in his stained hands. Evelyn Thorne remained motionless, but I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. The circle was broken. The office gathering had achieved what 40 years of police work could not. It had forced the truth out of the vellum and into the light. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet finality. "Call Inspector Cramer. Tell him the final chapter has been written. And tell Fritz that for dinner I should like the lamb with the rosemary infusion. My palate requires something clean after the bitterness of this affair." I headed for the phone. The gathering was over, the suspects were defeated, and the Gutenberg ghost was finally ready to be shelved for good. The brownstone felt quiet again, the pressure relieved, but the smell of old paper would linger in my nostrils for a long time to come. The office had settled into a state of crystalline clarity that usually follows the breaking of a long, feverish heat. Inspector Cramer had departed with his retinue, taking Julian Vane and Alistair Finch with him into the cold Manhattan night. Evelyn Thorne had gone as well, though she walked to the police car with a terrifying, frozen dignity that suggested she was already mentally cataloguing the books in the prison library. Silas Crane remained in the front room, sleeping the sleep of a man who had finally seen a ghost laid to rest. That left the three of us, Wolfe, the Gutenberg ghost, and me. The clock on the mantel ticked with a sharp, rhythmic precision that seemed to underscore the finality of the evening. Wolfe was leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his fingers tapping against the arms of his chair. He was in that state of intellectual repose that I've come to recognize as the post-mortem. He wasn't thinking about the arrests, he was thinking about the logic. I sat at my desk, my notebook open, waiting for the one piece of the puzzle that still felt like it was missing a corner. "The ink, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration. That was the pivot upon which the entire deception turned. Dr. Finch believed that by using a plum-colored iron gall ink, he was paying homage to the historical accuracy of the Gutenberg. He didn't realize that iron gall ink is a living thing. It reacts with the environment. Over 40 years, it absorbed the cyanide fixative Miss Thorne used to stabilize the synthetic vellum. It didn't just sit on the page, it became a reservoir for the gas. The mirrored signature Philip Hart discovered was not a transfer of ink, it was a chemical burn where the gas had leaked from one leaf to another. Philip wasn't looking at a typo, he was looking at a leak in a pressurized vessel. I leaned forward, my chin in my hand. So the locked room wasn't the mystery. The mystery was why Philip Hart didn't leave. He was so busy trying to understand the chemistry of the burn that he didn't realize the room was filling up with the very thing he was studying. But Vane had to turn the valves right to make sure the dose was lethal. Precisely, Wolfe remarked, his eyes half opening. Julian Vane was the catalyst. He knew that Philip had requested the blueprints. He knew that the secret was only hours away from being exposed. He didn't have to break into the vault, he was already there, acting as a security consultant for Percival Sterling. He simply waited for Philip to begin his evening study, closed the primary ventilation baffle, and allowed the ghost to do the rest. It was a murder by environmental manipulation, a crime that left no marks because the victim invited the weapon into his own lungs. "And Percival Sterling?" I asked. "He knew all of it?" "Sterling is a man who considers himself a god among mortals, Archie. To a man of his stature, the death of an assistant is a minor accounting error in the preservation of his own myth. He bankrolled the forgery because his ego could not survive the admission of a financial loss. He bankrolled the murder because his legacy could not survive the admission of a lie. He didn't pull a trigger, but he signed the checks for the silence. He is as much a part of the ghost as the vellum itself." Wolfe reached out and touched the cover of the Bible, the real fragments I'd retrieved from the sub-basement. He didn't handle it with the reverence of a collector. He handled it with the respect of a man who knows that truth has a weight that can crush the people who try to bury it. The reveal, Archie, is that the Gutenberg ghost was never a book. It was a mirror. It reflected the covetousness of Finch, the artistic arrogance of Thorne, and the predatory greed of Vane. They all thought they were protecting a masterpiece. They were actually protecting their own reflections in a poisoned glass. Philip Hart was the only one who tried to look past the reflection to the reality of the word, and for that he was silenced. But the word, as the page on my desk reminds us, has a habit of surviving its own executioners. I looked at the vellum page, the bloodstain on the corner now appearing like a dark, ancient seal. It was a lot of death for a few pieces of sheepskin and some iron gall ink. But as I watched Wolfe, I realized that for him, the case was never about the value of the book. It was about the affront to his own sense of order. Someone had used the intellectual pursuit of history to mask the physical pursuit of murder, and in Nero Wolfe's universe, that is the one sin that cannot be edited out of the record. The DA will have a hard time with the environmental manipulation charge I noted, closing my notebook. But with Vane's key and the residue in the vial, they've got enough to start the process. And Saul's testimony about the sub-basement will seal the lid on the binding room for good. The lid is already sealed, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a tone of finality. The Sterling Library will be liquidated to pay the settlements, and the fragments of the ghost will likely end up in a museum where they can be viewed through 3 inches of tempered glass. The secret is out, the ink is dry, and the air is clear. Now, if you please, tell Fritz that the lamb is overdue. I find that a victory over the dishonest always leaves me with a remarkably sharp appetite. I stood up, feeling the weight of the night finally start to lift. The reveal was complete, the logic was sound, and the Gutenberg ghost had been filed under closed. I headed for the kitchen, the smell of rosemary already starting to drift through the hall, a clean, living scent that finally pushed the smell of old paper out of the house. The following morning, the brownstone had reclaimed its usual atmosphere of heavy, scholarly peace, as if the ghosts of the Sterling Library had been exorcised by the mere act of scrubbing the office floor. The sun was hitting the back of the house, casting long golden rectangles across the parquet where, only hours ago, the Sterling Circle had sat in judgment of themselves. I had spent the early hours at the precinct dealing with the kind of paperwork that makes you wish you'd taken up a simpler profession like lion taming. By the time I walked back into the office at 11, the city outside was humming with its usual chaotic energy, but inside, the air was as still as a frozen pond. Wolfe was in his chair, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at the space on his blotter where the blood-stained vellum had sat for 2 days. The page was gone, taken as evidence along with the fragments of the ghost and the silver key from the sub-basement. In its place was a fresh bottle of beer and a small delicate sprig of an orchid I didn't recognize, probably something Theodore had brought down to signal that the world was once again focused on things that grew rather than things that rotted. "The DA is happy, Wolfe," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack and sliding into my chair. "Cramer says Percival Sterling's lawyers are already trying to negotiate a deal that involves him donating his entire collection to the city in exchange for staying out of a cell. They've got Vane on the hook for the actual tampering, and Finch and Thorne are busy blaming each other for the fixative. It's a regular festival of finger-pointing." Wolfe didn't look up. He poured his beer with a steady hand, the head forming a perfect creamy inch at the top of the glass. "The happiness of the district attorney is a matter of supreme indifference to me, Archie. The integrity of the solution is what matters. A problem has been posed, its variables have been analyzed, and its conclusion has been reached. The fact that it also happens to involve the dismantling of a criminal network is merely a pleasant side effect. Pleasant for us, maybe. Not so much for Silas Crane, I noted. He's currently at a hotel in Midtown, wondering if he's going to be the next one to be audited. He told me to tell you that he's never going to look at a first edition the same way again." Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep subterranean skepticism. Mr. Crane is a man who preferred the comfort of a lie to the effort of a truth. He was the curator of a graveyard, and he was content to stay in the dark as long as the headstones were polished. He deserves his insomnia. It is a small price to pay for 40 years of willful blindness. Fritz came in then, carrying a tray with a small covered dish and a fresh pot of coffee. He looked at the spot where Dr. Finch had sat and gave the rug a suspicious squint, as if he expected a plum-coloured ink stain to manifest out of thin air. "Everything is in order, Archie?" he asked, his voice a comfortingly domestic baritone. "As in order as it ever gets, Fritz," I said, leaning back. "The air is clear, the books are closed, and the only ghosts left in this house are the ones Wolfe keeps in his library." Fritz nodded, satisfied, and retreated to the kitchen. A few minutes later, the elevator groaned, a sound I've come to associate with the return of the mountain to the plains, and the rhythmic thud of Wolfe's footsteps signaled the end of his midday session. He had spent the last hour with the orchids, a ritual that always seems to reset his internal clock after a brush with the ugliness of the human condition. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration. "Tell Saul that his bonus for the sub-basement work will be processed this afternoon, and remind him, if he ever again uses military surplus goggles in my presence, I shall expect him to provide a scientific justification for the aesthetic insult." "I'll tell him," I said, smiling at my typewriter. "But I think he's more worried about the halon residue on his jacket. He says it smells like a dry cleaner's shop in a blizzard." Wolfe settled back into his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He looked at the clock on the mantel, then at the bookshelves that lined the room. "The Gutenberg ghost was a lesson in the dangers of the fixed idea, Archie. Sterling believed his wealth could buy history. Finch believed his expertise could mask a crime. Thorne believed her art could replace reality. They all forgot that the truth is the only first edition that cannot be forged. It has a way of surfacing, even when it has been buried in a vault for 40 years. He reached for his book, a thick volume on the history of Mediterranean spices, and I knew the case was officially filed away in the archives of his mind. The death among the rare books was no longer a mystery, it was a memory, and for Wolfe, memories are only useful if they can be used to solve the next problem. I stood up and went to the window, looking out at the street. The afternoon traffic was picking up, and a delivery truck was double-parked near the corner. It was a normal, noisy, chaotic Manhattan day. The vellum was gone, the air was clear, and Nero Wolfe was back in his world, where the only thing that mattered was the next meal and the next bloom. It was a good day to be alive on West 35th Street, even if the world was a little less rare than it had been yesterday. And Archie, Wolfe's voice drifted out from behind the book. "Yeah? Tell Fritz that for lunch tomorrow. I should like the sweetbreads with the chestnut puree. My palate requires something substantial after the dry dust of the Sterling collection." "Sweetbreads and chestnuts," I repeated, heading for the kitchen. "I think we can manage that, just as long as we don't have to read any Latin while we eat." The office door closed behind me, sealing in the silence. The case was finished, the accounts were settled, and the only thing left to do was wait for the doorbell to ring again.